History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side. Today's B-Sider is the spiritual co-founder of Nazism.
Before we really get into today's topic, I think it's very important that we start this episode by echoing a common refrain of our podcast. And normally we say slavery is bad. But in this case, and we've mentioned this on at least in our first episode.
You're not gonna say it's good, right?
At least in our first episode, we said Nazis are bad. That was one of our top pinnacles of the History's B-Side podcast. And
in case anybody was curious about our views,
we're really going to reinforce that on today's episode.
Nazis are bad.
Nazis are bad. We've had kind of a wide array of people over the 12 previous episodes we've had before this one. And I think a lot of the time we kind of build them up to sound sort of heroic. And in many cases they are. Especially when you talk about some of the women and the minorities that have been kind of overlooked in the history books. It's good for us to tell their story. I think that's kind of why we chose this as our podcast topic, to like research the people that have been forgotten that were very impactful on history. Some of them may have like shady parts of their history too that we obviously need to address and want to talk about.
Right.
But for the most part, the people we've talked about thus far have been sort of important and respectable, at least in their own right, for things that they've accomplished. Today's episode is probably the first one that I did not really find any redeeming qualities about.
Nothing?
I mean,
you didn't have like a childhood friend that remembered him fondly?
No. There's not a whole lot about his childhood, and we'll talk about that.
He was a terrible child.
History was written by the victors, and we obviously, in present day, know how World War II started and ended, and there's not a lot of redeeming stories about anyone that was involved in the Nazi Party. So especially this guy who we'll see was pretty important in the founding of the Nazi Party. So I think there's really nothing that we're going to say in this episode that is intended to make him sound respectable or heroic or build him up in any way that's in a good light. And in some cases, this might not be one of our more fun episodes, but it'll be a lot easier to speak from that perspective of, this guy was bad. And we understand that. Yeah. But in the same right, his story is worth telling because, as we'll talk about, there's a lot of parallels between what happened then and the way that these ideas and these patterns of history can be repeated pretty easily even today or in the future. So it's good to know where these ideas come from and how someone who's relatively unknown can really shape the future.
Right.
I picked this topic out before we even started the podcast. When we came up with this idea, I was looking at different people that might be worth featuring, and this is someone I stumbled across. Obviously, World War II, the Holocaust, Nazis, such a huge part of history. It's hard not to mention them on a history podcast. So it's kind of amazing that we took 13 episodes to get into it. And the reason I pushed it back even this far is just that I wanted to make sure that we were comfortable talking and communicating the story because it is an important topic. And I just didn't want to, tell it in the wrong way and make sure that we researched it right.
You wanted to do it justice.
And as I've been researching this topic, I really regret picking the topic because, some of these episodes we've done, especially like Helga Meyer, was a lot of fun. That was just kind of like a fun story. And Jing Shi, even though she was kind of, maybe not the best person at the time, was a fun story to talk about. This one was just kind of start to finish a sad story, and just really not a lot of heroes and good people that you want to talk about.
Right.
I've always had kind of like this basis of knowledge about the Holocaust. When I was in 8th grade, we had this teacher. He was an English teacher named Jesse McLean. And I'm sure we have a lot of our local friends and listeners that went to Center Middle School in Boardman that had him and would attest to the fact that he was just obsessed with the Holocaust. Like it was his whole...
I went to the other middle school, Glenwood, and I know about him from hearing about this Holocaust thing. We had a Holocaust program too, but it wasn't like one specific teacher. We just learned about it extensively in 8th grade. But I remember hearing stories about his...
It was start to finish
coverage.
In 8th grade. Everything that we did in that class related to the Holocaust. And it wasn't a history class. It was an English class. We just had to do all these research papers and we read books and everything that we did tied into the Holocaust. So at least people in my generation of Boardman students from that middle school got a lot of Holocaust background information.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot that I didn't know. I mean, it's easy to talk
there's
about.
A ton to know in general.
Yeah. It's one of, I don't know, it's hard to say that it's the most important moment in history because, I mean, history is so vast and there's so much to cover. But I guess because it's still so recent, there's a lot to it and it impacted the entire world and just the ramifications of it just kind of overshadow a lot that we talk about in history, that it is a really important thing. And it's easy to remember the numbers, like 12 million Jews were systematically killed through concentration camps and rounding them up into ghettos and all this stuff. And it's kind of mind-boggling to think about. Like, have you ever been to the Holocaust Museum in DC?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a lot.
Yeah. I think learning about it in a textbook versus going there and seeing the things is just completely different. Seeing it in person and trying to, I don't know, take that in and understand what these people went through.
I've always wanted to visit, and this is like a weird thing to say maybe, because it's not even like I want to visit it, but I feel compelled to visit one of the concentration camp sites.
Yeah.
Only to kind of, I feel like there's a connection to places, and I'm not like in my core like a spiritual person. I'm pretty skeptical about ghosts and stuff like that, but even going to like battlefields, like Civil War battlefields and places in our country, which are relatively new, I feel this kind of energy, you know? And like, I kind of want to go to get that experience and to understand through that energy, like the magnitude of this. 'Cause even going to the Holocaust museums, like you can go and it is super, you know, impactful and moving, you know, seeing like the thing I remember, and I think a lot of people remember, is the pile of shoes and the different artifacts and things like that. I think to be on the land would be a you know, kind of almost spiritual experience in a way.
We've looked into that, and obviously before the pandemic kind of shut down any chance of travel, we'd talked about doing like a train trip across Europe and trying to make stops. And I was looking for ways to work into somewhere that would allow us to see like Auschwitz or one of the other concentration camps or something like that. And I know that kind of, this is terrible, but like puts a damper on your whole trip because you're like there to sightsee and have fun. But like if I'm over there and able to go take that in, I want to do that.
Right.
But for as much as we know about the Holocaust, I think the part that's always kind of overlooked is sort of how we got into that situation, how Hitler came to power to take over Germany and really reshape much of Europe and eventually the world. And we know the story sort of that he wrote this Mein Kampf book while he was in prison, and because he had such backing with the Nazi party that once they became influential enough to take control of the German government, he was appointed to be chancellor. They were in just this divided country, and he at least gained enough support that he was able to be appointed chancellor. And at that point, he was really in charge of Germany, and that's what led to this whole eventual genocide and great atrocity in human history. But what's missing from the story is really, where did Hitler come from? Where did the Nazi Party come from? And all of this really comes back to the man that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
You started the episode by calling him the spiritual co-founder of Nazism. And, you know, I was between a couple different titles for this episode. It was that one, or it was Hitler's mentor, because that's really what this guy was. Or he's also one of the founders of just the German Workers' Party, which later transitions into the Nazi Party. So he was very influential in his time, but he's someone who's just kind of cleaned out from the history books. It'll be interesting to hear his story and to go through it a little bit. This might be, well, who knows, we'll see where we end up, but maybe one of our longer episodes, and obviously it won't be as fun or funny as some of the other ones we've talked about, but it's definitely worth digging into and hearing all of it. So listeners, please bear with us. I think it'll be an important episode, and hopefully we can tell the story clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the word you just used, important, because I'm sitting here thinking, and as I was looking through your notes, thinking, you know, we all got this pretty extensive Holocaust history education. We, you know, in pop culture, in education across the board, get a pretty thorough background covering of the events of the Holocaust and of World War II. But I almost feel like after having read up about today's topic, we almost like view Hitler as though he existed in a vacuum. Like there's not a lot of talk about this. There's not a lot of talk about why it like how it came to be. It's almost like, oh yeah, there's this terrible stuff. This terrible guy did it. This is what, like,
it's almost like he acted alone too. Like we don't think about
like
the
he was
people
just
around
like
Hitler.
Right. He just like dreamed this up one day and then wandered onto the scene and made it happen.
Right. But that's obviously not the case, and not how anyone comes to power.
Right. Yeah, I'm excited to discuss this.
So before we get into the heavier, not so fun topic, I thought we could start with something a little more lighthearted, a little bit goofy, but it'll end up connecting us back to the story. But I don't know. Let's, I guess, do as much comic relief as we can before we get into everything. How much do you know about Norwegian theater?
An enormous amount. It's my favorite type of theater, in fact.
Good. Can you give us a little background in it before we start talking about it more?
Yeah. It's originated in Norway.
Okay.
Of course.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll just
it probably
tell you about
primarily featured white people.
I'll tell you about a play from Norwegian theater, and you just jump in whenever you have any of your expertise that, you know, you want to enlighten us with. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
So we're going to talk about a specific play that came from Norwegian theater. It's called Peer Gynt.
That's my favorite play. That's my
Good.
favorite Norwegian
You're an
play.
expert. So Peer Gynt was published in 1867 by a Norwegian dramatist named Henrik Ibsen. And he originally didn't intend this to be like a stage play. He just wrote it out as a long form poem. And then it was kind of eventually adapted for stage. But it's the story of a life based on procrastination and avoidance. And some of the characters in this story were actually based on Ibsen's own family. He talks about Peer Gynt, which in a way that the main character is sort of loosely based on him. It's never explicitly stated that way, but it kind of shows how he may have perceived himself. But he also wrote Peer Gynt's father to be sort of resemble his own father, and Peer Gynt's mother resembled his own mother. So it kind of was viewed as just, this is how maybe Henrik Ibsen viewed his own life, or his own purpose, I guess, even if he never actually said it. And maybe we're making some bad assumptions about him by saying that, but we'll just get into the play and you'll see it's just so goofy and ridiculous, but I don't know. I thought it might be a little bit lighthearted on this otherwise depressing episode. The play itself is 5 acts long. We're going to sort of talk a little bit about the first 2, and then we'll try to wrap up the last 3 quickly, because it is a very, very long play. But in Act 1, Peer Gynt is introduced, and he's just this lazy, egotistical poet. He's not really doing anything with his life. His father, John Gynt, was this highly respected man in the town, very wealthy, but he squanders all his money and then just abandons his family. And he leaves trying to regain his wealth, but he just abandons his family, so it kind of just leaves Peer Gynt and his mother, whose name is Ace, alone. And his mother chastises him for just being lazy, for not doing anything with his life, for squandering opportunities, and for being just a head in the clouds liar, essentially. Like he tells all these fantastical stories, but he's really not doing anything with his life. And she blames him because he missed out on his chance to marry a girl named Ingrid, who's this wealthy farmer's daughter in the town, but Ingrid is now engaged to marry someone else. So she thinks that Peer has just completely missed his chance for a better life and missed out on this girl choosing to marry him. So Peer, feeling, I guess, motivated by his mother's scolding, goes to the wedding, Ingrid's wedding, and while there, he's taunted by all the guests that are at the wedding, except for this one girl who he's never met before. This girl's name is Solveig. And she takes an interest in Peer, even though he doesn't necessarily give her the time of day. And even though her own father is telling her not to get involved with Peer because they know his reputation. But she just finds him interesting and fascinating, and she's kind of has this, I guess, crush on Peer. Now, Solveig eventually leaves the wedding, and Peer is still there, and he gets drunk. And, when you get drunk, you have bad ideas. So Peer gets drunk and then decides to kidnap Ingrid, kidnap the bride of the wedding, and he carries her off into the mountains. Just runs away with her, steals her from her own wedding, takes her to the mountains.
It's a solid move.
And that's where we end Act 1. In Act 2, we open with Peer, he's still in the mountains, but he's banished for having kidnapped Ingrid. And in order to escape his fate, he abandons her in the mountains. He continues wandering around the mountains, and at this point, his mother, Ace, Solveig, and her father go looking for Peer, just trying to find him because he's just disappeared. This is where his story gets kind of weird. If this part isn't already weird, this is where Peer Gynt really takes a turn to get weird. He's wandering the mountains, and he meets these 3 dairymaids, and as one does, gets drunk with them. The dairymaids are kind of just hanging out, waiting to be courted by mountain trolls.
I've been there, drunk with 3 dairymaids waiting for a mountain troll. It's just a Saturday night,
Like reading this, it was just so bizarre, and I was like, I don't know how this ties into everything, but it does.
Well, what's interesting is in reading this, it seems really bizarre, but in kind of studying some of the poets, especially European poets, like pre-18th century, they're all kind of like this. They're playboys. I don't want to draw that's a pretty generalized statement, but like, you look at Lord Byron, and he was that was his calling card, was being a playboy, and this kind of like, really almost risky, cares to the wind, playboy player lifestyle. I don't know why, but it was just, I don't know if it was like the cause or the effect of being a poet.
Being a poet and drinking and...
Yeah. Well, I'm sure drinking and drug use didn't help, but...
Well, at some point, Peer is drunk with these dairymaids, or it's the next day and he's hungover or something, and he knocks himself unconscious. So the rest of this act happens in a dream inside of his head. So if this isn't already wild, weird enough, we're now in dream mode.
Turns into a dream.
And in his dream, Peer meets a woman who's dressed all in green, and he finds out that she's the daughter of the Troll Mountain King. And he meets the Troll Mountain King, who gives Peer permission to marry his daughter and become a troll himself if he can only accomplish a few certain tasks. And Peer does take on the challenge a little bit, but being the lazy, never really do much with his life person that he is, he eventually gives up on these challenges and leaves. And he tries to abandon now that this woman in green, but he finds out that she is pregnant.
He'd have been a great dad.
Right?
Just peacing out every day.
just in time, he finds out that this woman is pregnant. And while he denies having touched her, the Troll Mountain King, her father, insists that the child is his. Now, there's this weird conversation plot point that happens between Peer and the king, the Troll King, that talks about sort of the egoism of the trolls. The king asks Peer, what is the difference between troll and man? And he explains that men say, to thyself be true, while trolls say, be true to yourself and to hell with the world.
I mean, is there a difference between the two of those? I get that, like, to hell with the world is left out of men's statements, but
I think...
is the point that they're kind of the same? Is he trying to draw a comparison between men and trolls?
Yeah, I think the way that I'm interpreting it is just that when men say to thyself be true, it kind of just means know your purpose and be who you are and be who you're made to be, intended to be. But with trolls, it's more focus on yourself. Do what's good for you and forget everyone else.
Regardless.
Yes.
Gotcha.
So then there's other mysterious character who's called the Boig. I might be mispronouncing this because I don't speak Norwegian, but I believe he's called the Boig.
How dare you?
And there's no real like description of this character. He's just kind of this weird mystical being, I guess. But he has this common saying, which is essentially the phrase "go around." He says "go around," and Peer interprets this as his way of saying basically beat around the bush. So Peer takes these two mottos from the Troll King and from the Boig to define himself throughout the rest of the play. He will be himself, whatever he interprets that to be, and he will beat around the bush, never really having to face himself or face the truth of who he is or who he's intended to be.
It kind of seems like the joining of these two mottos is contradictory. Like, doesn't he kind of betray the first motto, to thyself be true, if he's also beating around the bush and not facing that truth or that self?
I think it is if you're using what the Troll King calls the man definition of to thyself be true. But if you're using the troll version, it's kind of just worry about yourself. Don't worry about what other people want. Just worry about yourself. And then the last three acts of this play, acts 3 through 5, they're just kind of, Peer goes on this weird adventure around the world, I guess, sort of looking for purpose, but it's just kind of, we'll wrap it up because I know we're getting kind of long in this first section, but eventually Peer meets back up with Solveig and they live together, but out in the wilderness in the mountains away from civilization. But eventually the woman in green returns to him, and now she has her child, and she finds Peer and curses him. So in order to sort of protect Solveig, he abandons her again. And the only time he really makes an appearance back in civilization is he stops home to see his mother right before she dies. Then Peer takes this trip through Africa, and specifically North Africa, and he's constantly taking on all these other jobs, many of them criminal. He meets various lovers and abandons them, sort of the same pattern that we see from Peer.
This dude just loves abandoning people.
Yeah, he's not a very good guy, I guess. While he's in Egypt, he speaks to the great Sphinx because he thinks it's the Boig, and he's trying to, I guess, find meaning and interpret it. Eventually, he ends up in a madhouse, and he believes himself to be an emperor. Finally, he's around people who are kind of in their own worlds, and Peer is now in his own world and able to basically accomplish what he thought was his purpose of being an emperor of the world. It's really just a weird kind of story mentality.
I feel like it's a really complicated way to say, like, you kind of have to care about other people to find purpose. Like,
yeah, sort of. But eventually Peer returns home, and he's now an old man. He's broken, penniless, and starting to realize that his life has just been wasted and he's lost everything. The Troll King reappears to tell him that he's actually been a troll most of his life, which I think is just an interpretation of the way that he kind of viewed himself and his purpose. And the Boig reappears and leads Peer to this sort of sad and confusing Judgment Day scene. It was really hard to interpret this in a very simple way, but essentially Peer is relying on Solveig to blame him for some of the things that he's done wrong, and in that she would be able to save his soul. But Solveig is just so blinded by her affection for Peer that she denies him ever having done anything wrong, and in that way kind of condemns him.
Whoa, that's a little deep. I feel like that would take a minute to think about. But
Yeah, so reading through a summarized version of the translation of the Norwegian play for me to do this podcast was very dense. I mean, all in all, this whole play is sort of ridiculous. I don't know, like, maybe I'm just not in the right time to have appreciated it, but it's viewed in its own time as just satire in Norwegian egotism, narrowness, and self-sufficiency.
Well, I can't sit here and really say that it doesn't, even in this summarized form, kind of resonate with me in a way. Like I'm just sitting here like it seems to me that it's almost like a cautionary coming of age tale.
Yeah,
where like
in a way.
Like I said, it's warning against complete indulgence in your own desires, and there's even themes of like, I don't know, the difference between truly knowing yourself and then just kind of following pure desire. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot that could be said about this. We're clearly not an English literature or literature podcast, but
I don't know. It's just a weird story, and someone who's listening to this right now and wondering why they've been listening to 25 minutes of, nothing really about our main topic, and why does Phil do this on his episodes? Peer Gynt does play a role into the story of today's topic, but ultimately, like today's topic, it's really just the story of an evil, mad, sad, egotistical poet who creates no good in the world and whose life and accomplishments are ultimately forgotten. And that statement applies to both Peer Gynt and our topic today, whose name is Dietrich Eckart.
No, I'm just sad.
It's going to get a whole lot sadder.
All right.
And on that note, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll get into today's topic, the spiritual co-founder of Nazism.
We'll be right back.
When we decided to make a podcast, the first thing we did was download Anchor.
Because we have no money, and Anchor is free.
You can also record and edit your podcast right from your phone or a computer.
Then, it only takes one click to share your podcast to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more.
And because we have no money, Anchor helps pair us with advertisers and lets our listeners support the History's B-Side podcast directly on our page.
If you've got an idea for your own podcast, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
All right, now we're going to get into today's main topic and kind of the story of how he relates to the founding of Nazism and what eventually leads to Hitler and the Holocaust. Our topic today is a man named Johann Dietrich Eckart. He was born on March 23rd, 1868, near Nuremberg in the Kingdom of Bavaria, which was at the time an independent German state. It's a part of Germany, but still sort of its own region.
So he was pretty old. I don't know why in my head I was picturing him like being a younger man, but he was 50 when Hitler's rise to power kind of came about, huh?
Yeah, he was 21 years older than Hitler. So he was...
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, he was around for a bit, and kind of his ideology is sort of what will eventually influence Hitler. And we'll get a lot more into that as this episode goes on. His father, Christian Eckhart, was a royal notary and a lawyer, pretty scholarly and influential. His mother, Anna Eckhart, was a devout Catholic, but she died when he was only 10 years old. Dietrich kind of had a checkered childhood. He was expelled from a lot of schools, a few different schools when he was younger. So you'll kind of see that this, I don't want to say mindset or behavioral issues were a problem later on, but just he has this sort of struggle throughout his life with people and the way that he acts and the way that he thinks. And I think a lot of the I guess, demons that he faces are reflected in the way his story turns out.
Mm-hmm.
He originally studied law in Nuremberg and eventually switched to study medicine in Munich. But by 1891, he decided on a career as a poet, a playwright, and a journalist.
This is like a 21st century parent's worst nightmare.
Right?
Oh, he's going to be a lawyer. Oh my God, he's going to be a doctor. Hey, Mom, I'm going to switch to humanities.
Liberal arts.
That's not to bash the humanities. I have a humanities degree.
You
but
really make fun of a lot of our listeners.
I'm one of you. I get to make fun of us.
Eckhart's father passed in 1895. Dietrich was now about 27, and he left him a considerable amount of money, but Dietrich quickly squandered the money on drugs and alcohol, and he was diagnosed with a morphine addiction by 1899 and moved to Berlin. So you can see he has these vices and these problems that are going to plague him throughout his life.
Mm-hmm.
While he was in Berlin, he ended up writing a number of plays. A lot of them were autobiographical, but he had very little success as a playwright. In fact, almost none. And he blamed this on society sort of being beneath him intellectually, or, as we'll see a common theme in this episode, he blamed his failures on the Jews.
Of course.
He thought that the Jews controlled the theater industry, and this was really kind of the beginning of Eckhart's anti-Semitism. The one play that he did have success with was his adaptation of Peer Gynt.
Yes, Peer returns.
You know, this funny, goofy
Of
Norwegian story that we just heard so much about. Eckhart adapted his own version of it in 1912, but his version portrayed Peer in a different light. Rather than being this loser who kind of wastes his life and wanders around the world trying to find purpose but ultimately failing, he portrays Peer as a German hero fighting against the oppressive Jewish trolls.
Okay, I feel like Eckhart saw this play, read this play, whatever he did. He experienced this play, saw himself in Peer, for sure, but like missed the entire moral of the play, and then just decided to remake it in a way where he didn't have to face the moral of the play.
Yes, exactly.
So make himself the hero.
His adaptation of it, he wrote as if the trolls were Jews and the Boig was Jewish, and all these people and forces that worked against Peer finding meaning and finding success were the Jews and the people that were preventing Dietrich Eckart himself from finding success in his own career. So he related to Peer Gynt, this character that we again said was just this sort of loser who wasted his own life and abandoned everyone that actually cared about him. And it really shows his anti-Semitic ideology that's going to be kind of the basis for everything that he accomplishes in his life. But this play was a success. It was performed over 600 times in Berlin alone, and it made Eckhart very wealthy and helped him to develop these important social contacts around the country. Following his success with Peer Gynt, Eckhart moved back to Munich and he joined what was called the Thule Society. The Thule Society was this German nationalist study group. It was essentially a who's who of the early German anti-Semitic leaders. But they believed that in the coming of a German Messiah who would one day redeem Germany after its defeat in World War I. And they wrote a poem to that end referring to, quote, the Great One, the Nameless One, whom all can sense but no one saw.
Interesting. Do you think, I mean, you might get into this later, but do you think this idea that they had of this Messiah was known to Hitler or influenced him? Or do you think he just happened to end up stepping into those shoes?
We will talk a little bit about this later. I do think Hitler knew about this idea. I don't know that Hitler, who knows, maybe, probably, wanted to be this quote-unquote German Messiah.
Yeah.
I don't know that he necessarily expected to be when he became a part of the Nazi Party, but through his success in climbing the ladder within the party and becoming so influential, maybe believed that he really was this person. And you'll see some of that in his own writings, especially in Mein Kampf. He talks about this need to be seen as a self-made man. Like, he doesn't credit anyone else for his own success except for himself. And I think that's kind of the Messiah-esque ideology, that he is better and above everyone else, that he was able to accomplish this. Getting back to Eckhart, following World War One, he became a writer and an editor for the German nationalist periodical. And pausing right here, I'm going to mess up a lot of German pronunciations in this episode. I know they're basically pronounced the way they're written, but I just can't do it. I can't say German without like it just not coming out right.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't do Greek great. We didn't do French great. We didn't do Spanish great. It's fine. We might as well just keep the ball rolling.
Right.
This is not a language podcast.
So he wrote for this German nationalist periodical called Auf gut Deutsche, which translates to in plain German, and basically simple, easy to read, easy to understand. And this was a right-wing anti-Semitic publication. Some of his writings express that he opposed the newly formed Weimar Republic.
I only know about this because I Googled it, maybe embarrassingly so, but can you briefly explain what the Weimar Republic was?
Yeah, the Weimar Republic was essentially the current government of Germany that was set up following World War One, sort of as part of the Treaty of Versailles.
Okay.
It really was a step in a different direction from what Germany had prior to World War One. So a lot of the nationalist publications and writers and ideologists were staunchly opposed to it.
Yeah.
His writings also argued that the Treaty of Versailles itself was treason. And the reason for this was just that, you know, the Treaty of Versailles required Germany to establish the Weimar Republic. It caused them to disarm their entire military, to really disband and take away everything that made Germany Germany. So
yeah, I mean, the one thing about this that I guess comes familiar to me is that I do know from learning during school that the Treaty of Versailles was pretty harsh on Germany. In fact, some scholars kind of implied that the Allied framers of that treaty almost, like, not caused directly, but definitely didn't help the situation regarding World War II and how harsh they were on Germany.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a unusual stance by any means. A lot of people would say that the whole reason World War II ended up happening was because of the oppressive restrictions and requirements put on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
At least in some sense led to the popular nationalism in Germany, which we'll see leads to Hitler.
Yeah.
His writings also, of course, believed that the Social Democrats and the Jews were responsible for Germany's loss in World War I.
So Bernie Sanders.
Should I not
say that? You can.
No, this is terrible, but like my brain went to say like Bernie Sanders is lucky that he was born in America and not in 1930s Germany or whatever. But like,
oh my God,
it's true. I mean,
you're not wrong.
I mean, he's probably pretty much exactly what Dietrich Eckart would have been opposed to, a socialist Jew.
Bernie, the enemy of the far right, for 100 years.
Even today. Eckhart's beliefs were influenced by a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is a book that I've heard of even before reading this. I don't know that much about it and still don't know a ton about it because it's kind of an interesting topic in its own. But they're essentially these fake... It's sort of a hoax, but there's fake texts that describe a baseless conspiracy theory of this Jewish plan for world domination. And these books have been proven false, but they were still very widely spread as anti-Semitic beliefs grew around the world in the 1920s and 30s. They originated in Russia and were distributed across Europe and into America. And actually, if you look up into it, Henry Ford was one of the widest printers and distributors of this book and led to a lot of anti-Semitic beliefs in America. And the book is still relevant today because it's cited by a lot of our modern neo-fascists, the modern day Nazis that we still have crawling out through the gutters of America every so often.
That doesn't surprise me. I know there's like a lot of these comparisons, but even just limited to this specific point, this like baseless conspiracy of world domination, it's eerily similar to what you hear out of QAnon right now. Like,
Yeah.
it is like this idea that there's this conspiracy basically still run by the Jews now. I mean, it's always the Jews for some reason that's going to, you know, take over and make this new world order with Bill Gates and Barack Obama and whatever. I mean, I don't know the details of it, but it is kind of eerily similar.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about how some ideologies don't necessarily change too much over time. In January of 1919, Dietrich Eckart co-founded, here's another German one, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, which is the German Workers' Party, or the DAP. He co-founded it with Gottfried Fieder and Anton Drexler. And this party was to serve two purposes. Number one, to focus on the needs of the working class. And two, nationalism. Of course. Eckhart published the party newspaper, and he wrote the party anthem, which was called Deutschland erwache, which means Germany awake. Now, in September of 1919, they would have these meetings for the party that they would invite people to attend to kind of give updates on what the party was doing and some of their plans and their beliefs and ideas. So they had these meetings. In September of 1919, a young intelligence officer who was tasked by his military leaders to monitor the activities of the DAP attended one of these meetings. And this man found that the party's ideas were very similar to his own. He even got into a heated debate with another member of the party who disagreed with what the party was saying for their ideas. Now, Eckhart and Drexler and some of the other party leaders were so impressed with this man's speaking skills that they invited the young man, who was named Adolf Hitler, to join the political party.
There he is.
Finally, he enters our story.
At least early as this, it doesn't at least appear that he was like on the path to dictatorship power or whatever you want to call it. Like, it almost feels like he stumbled into this. And
he actually originally refused to be a part of the party. Like, he didn't want to be involved with the German Workers' Party, but it was Hitler's army superiors who encouraged him to continue with this, to join the party, and they actually sort of gave him some financial backing to continue to support the party. And I don't know if the reason is just that they wanted to keep monitoring what the DAP was doing.
Yeah.
Or maybe they believed in some of the ideas themselves and they just wanted to have a man on the inside. So Hitler didn't necessarily want to be a part of this, but he continued with it. And I mean, we'll see what happens with him being involved here. As he was more involved with the party, his persuasive speeches and the fact that he had this military backing actually quickly propelled him into a leadership role within the party. And he took on all of their public speaking roles. He was clearly the best speaker in the group, very influential. People came to hear Hitler speak, and the party grew as a result. Their numbers and membership started to grow and grow because they had this young, well-spoken man who was backing a lot of their ideas. In February of 1920, they wanted to appeal to a larger group of people to continue to grow their movement. But at the time, the most popular political movement was the socialist movement. So in order to appeal to people that agreed with socialism, the party changed its name to Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or as we know it today, the Nazi Party. Hitler himself disapproved of the socialist label, did not like it, but that was specifically regarding, racial or sexual equality. But he did relent to the name change so long as it was the National Socialist Party, because the nationalism is what was important to Hitler, establishing the true German citizens as the forefront focus of the party.
Yeah.
They wanted to, by using this label, National Socialist, to redefine socialism itself to apply to only those with German blood. Later that month, the party published its first 25 points, which was their platform, and included things like rejecting the Treaty of Versailles, calling for the reunification of Germany, equal rights for German citizens, but of course not foreigners or immigrants, redistributing income and war profits, profit sharing among the large industries, nationalization of trusts, increase in old age pensions, and free education.
So, I mean, some of this seems, I mean, what seems to be what we today would call in America socialism. Especially, I mean, the free education. Do you know, like, the redistribution of income and war profits, was that intended to balance out income disparity?
I don't know exactly,
or wealth disparity?
but I would venture to guess that it was intended to help, the everyday man. They were the German Workers' Party.
German Workers' Party. Okay.
And it really is, you hear this and you think, these aren't half bad ideas. Like, this is what socialism is sort of supposed to be.
No,
of course,
at this point, they're not.
Theirs is national socialism, so it's only intended to help the natural German-born citizens, not the Jews or the immigrants or anything like that. But if you take the national part out of it, you could hear this party's platform and think, this makes sense. I could get behind this.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the idea behind why these movements are so dangerous.
Yeah.
Because if you overlook, the glaringly bad racist part of it, of course the ideas don't sound that bad. Because every political movement, every political party has some basis of idea that says, here's ways that we can make this better. And if you can look past the one part that really sticks out to you as being really bad, it doesn't sound terrible.
Well, and that's where, like, I think we go wrong in a way in the way we cover the Holocaust in education, because I think it's important, of course, to discuss the Holocaust part of it. Like, that, I think, should be like the main motivator behind we can't let this happen again. But I feel like too often we end there. We end with we can't let this happen again. Mm-hmm. And then we never discuss why or how it happened. And like we said earlier, right, like, Hitler didn't exist in a vacuum. The Nazi Party didn't exist in a vacuum. And I think most democracies, I mean, Germany was a democracy at this time, or a budding democracy. And I think many countries and governing systems are a lot closer to this than most of us would like to think they are. Like, when you start to, especially in conditions where vast amounts of people are unhappy or are suffering or don't feel like they've been cared for by their government, it's really, really easy on a mass scale to join the idea of bettering the country with the idea of doing it at the expense of this group A, whatever you want to call it, whether it's another country's citizens or another ethnic group or whatever. I think that's something not enough people focus on. I
know we're already starting to run long, so let's get how our
my rant is over.
No, it's not. It's all good and it's all important, but make sure people actually hear the story of how our person here ties into Hitler and this movement.
Yeah.
Hitler actually had a closer bond with Dietrich Eckart than he did the other party leaders. I found a writing from a Nazi resistance journalist whose name was Konrad Heinen, and at the time he wrote, quote, "The recognized spiritual leader of this small group was Eckhart. The journalist and poet, 21 years older than Hitler, he had a strong influence on the younger man, probably the strongest anyone ever has had on him, and rightly so. He was a gifted writer, satirist, orator, even, or so Hitler believed, thinker. Eckhart was the same sort of uprooted, agitated, and far from immaculate soul. He could tell Hitler that he, like Hitler himself, had lodged in flop houses and slept on park benches because of Jewish machinations, which, in his case, had prevented him from becoming a successful playwright." So you see how sort of Eckhart grew up with this idea that the Jews were always working against him, and that's why he had this anti-Semitic beliefs. And Hitler sort of had that rooted in himself as well, so the two were able to sort of relate and connect and share ideas in the way that Hitler didn't with the other leaders of this party.
Yeah.
Hitler viewed Eckhart as a teacher, a mentor, and even a fatherly friend. He never really admitted this publicly to maintain the air, like we talked about, of him being self-made, but it was pretty clear in his writings and his speeches. The two have exchanged their ideas and their political theories. Eckhart gave him books to read and corrected his style of speaking and his writing. Eckhart actually viewed Hitler as his protege.
I almost feel like, I mean, as far as I understand, Hitler's father was a pretty strict, cold, brutal dude, and probably didn't give much in terms of like emotional support or whatever you want to call it. So I almost feel like Eckhart in a way filled that gap for Hitler.
Maybe just showed him attention and helped him
Yeah.
get along in a way that his father didn't. And maybe Eckhart viewed Hitler as the leader that he himself couldn't be because he wasn't maybe as well
that's a good
spoken or didn't have the youthfulness to lead the party in the way that Hitler could.
Right.
Eckhart did, however, use these connections that he established through his success with Peer Gynt to involve Hitler with arts groups and political donors and other members of high society to establish his prominence and to his influence within the country. Eckhart was also one of the first perpetrators of what's known as the Hitler myth, which is sort of this belief that Hitler was a superior genius German messiah, so to say.
Okay. So eventually whether he himself saw that, they saw that in him.
The people saw that, yeah. And I found this really interesting concept that was within this Hitler myth idea. And this concept is called Führerprinzip, and it portrays Hitler as this infallible genius who was above party politics. It was this idea that the party leader is always right, that he's dedicated to protect the German people from outside forces, be they Jews or other foreigners, but he's also protecting them from internal forces like politicians across the traditional spectrum. That would be conservative, centrist, Democrats. Hitler was above them all, and only he could protect these people from the current leadership, the current government, and these internal forces that are keeping the people back.
Yeah.
In a way, and before I say this, I know we're near on approaching an hour into our podcast, but I want to make this point very clear. I staunchly disapprove of any connecting of Trump to Hitler, because we heard a lot of that in the last 4 years. And while there may be a lot of things that Trump did wrong that people don't like about Trump, and I have my criticisms as well, there is nothing that Trump did that in any way relates or compares to the atrocities that Hitler did on this earth. So when people say, oh, he's the second coming of Hitler, or show the Photoshop pictures of them in similar situations, that always struck a nerve with me, because to compare the two is kind of a slap in the face to everything that we know about the Holocaust and what the people went through and the people who suffered and died in this point of our history. And even if you want to get patriotic, the American soldiers who fought to free these people and fought against Nazi Germany. So I do not take lightly the comparison of anything about Trump to Hitler. But when I'm reading this concept of Führerprinzip, it's hard not to draw an analogy between the attraction of the Trump following group to the way that people portrayed Hitler through this concept of the leader is always right and he's protecting us. I mean, we heard that during Trump's campaign. Democrats hate him. The Republicans hate him. That's why we like him, because, you know, he doesn't give a damn what anyone in politics has to say. He works for the people. He works for us.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of, I mean, I don't want to get into a whole thing about our,
yeah, I mean,
our
I'm
own
sure
politics,
you and I could
but
have, you and I could have a 4-hour debate about this, but I think I agree with you. And this connects to what I was saying earlier. I agree that the media and a lot of people took and ran with that comparison to a degree that was no longer helpful. But I do think if you're really careful about the utilitarian use of connections, maybe not comparisons, but connections, I think it is important in some way to say, like, we're getting close. Like, these things look a lot like these other things. And I agree that nothing he did approaches the horrific terror that was Nazi Germany. And And I do wish, I guess I wish I saw a more intelligent approach to saying, like, some of the political atmosphere and techniques right now really resemble some of the political techniques and atmosphere of early 1920s Germany. That I can get behind. But the just outright, I agree that the outright outrage and pictures and stuff like that doesn't really help.
I think this goes back to what you said about us not fully understanding the concept of how the Holocaust happened. Like, we understand what happened, and we understand how what we know happened, but we don't understand how we got to the point of where did Hitler come from. And it's just, when you think about my biggest thing with the Trump presidency is just that I couldn't understand what people see in him. Whatever, like, if you thought he was a good president, then that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you about your beliefs in politics, because I know we're getting nowhere on that. But I just didn't understand the attraction. And as I read this, I'm kind of seeing, like, a lot of it is word for word some of the similar things that we heard when Trump was beginning his presidency. And what's scary to me in that is that, our democracy, government, republic, whatever you want to call it, what we have, is fragile in a way.
Yeah.
And if we didn't have a constant media reporting everything that Trump or whoever our current leader is does, or even social media where things travel quickly and are exposed, how far away are we from turning into a situation where this could happen? That we have, not even call it Trump, any person who gets this ideology of he can do no wrong, to being in a position of power to essentially become this dictator to take over a country in this way.
Right. Well, we all look at Nazi Germany and think, like, how could they let it happen?
Right.
It's like that. I think that phrase, that thought, while supernatural, extremely understandable, I've thought it, I've felt it, it almost has like an arrogance to it, where it's like, you could too, with like a couple psychological adjustments on a widespread scale, like, you'd be there. And that's where I think, like, we really, in addition to studying the history of it, of the horrific acts and having a respect for the suffering and the trauma, I think there needs to be a focus on the red flags.
And that's why it's important to know your history and to listen to really long podcasts about people you've never heard of who influence these parts of history.
We podcast because we care.
We care so much. Should we get back to our story?
Probably.
So Hitler is now a pretty influential leader in the Nazi party. And he's out traveling around Germany doing these recruitment and fundraising events. But in June of 1921, the current party leaders, specifically Drexler, attempt to merge with the German Socialist Party. They're trying to basically consolidate power to make their party bigger and to eventually get political influence in Germany. Now, when the party attempted to merge with the German Socialist Party, as we said, Hitler did not like socialism, and he threatened to resign. He threatened to leave the party. The party leaders realized how dangerous it would be to lose their most prominent and influential member, so they asked Eckhart to go and convince Hitler to stay in the party. So Eckhart goes and he talks to Hitler, and he got Hitler to withdraw his resignation because Eckhart convinced the rest of the party to make Hitler its Führer, or its dictator. Essentially, Hitler was now, because of Eckhart's influence on the party leaders, Hitler was now the top leader of the party for life. He could not be removed. He was now number one of the whole thing.
Do you think that the situation would have turned out the same or similar if Hitler had stuck to his resignation? Do you think another person would have been able to step into those shoes and create the same outcome?
I don't think so. I was just going to flatly say no, but I think this movement is growing, but I do think you need that super charismatic, influential person that Hitler was.
Yeah.
So maybe if there was someone else who was similar that could have filled that role, or maybe Hitler leaves and the people that join the party because of him follow him to whatever new thing he does, and he's still able to gain this influence. It's just not being in that time, imagining this hypothetical situation. It's hard to say whether it was Hitler was influential because he had this backing, or was this backing going to back Hitler no matter where he was.
Yeah.
But it is because of Eckhart that Hitler gets this position where he cannot be challenged anymore. He is now the number one person in the Nazi Party for life. Once Hitler gets to this established, prominent position in the party and is able to kind of create his own influence, he starts to push away from Eckhart. He starts to blame Eckhart for failed political meetings. They disagreed on some of their strategies for how to proceed as the party. Hitler ended up replacing Eckhart for managing the party newspaper, just kind of sort of snuffing out his voice
cold.
and his influence in the party. And I think that comes a little bit, like you said, with the sort of the Messiah complex sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, maybe he got to this high point and forgot about who got him there, or, you know, thought that he just didn't need him anymore.
Yeah.
At one point in 1923, Eckhart complained to a fellow member of the party that Hitler had megalomania halfway between a Messiah complex and Neroism.
So, I mean, he, whether strategically or not, he almost turned on Eckhart entirely in a way.
Yeah.
Like, their relationship ended.
Sort of. I mean, Eckhart wasn't so much involved with the party operations as much. He didn't necessarily hold as much prominence within the party, but he and Hitler still remained close emotionally and intellectually. Their relationship wasn't strictly political. They were very much close friends,
Gotcha.
and Eckhart was sort of his mentor, and they shared the general ideology. They just disagreed on some political strategies and how the party should proceed.
Sure. Okay.
It also didn't help that Eckhart's vices from when he was younger, his drinking and his morphine use, still plagued him to this day, and they kind of got in the way of his effectiveness within the party. So it gave Hitler some reason to sort of push him out of these influential positions, and kind of gave an excuse for him to blame some of the issues that they faced on him. One of the biggest disagreements between Eckhart and Hitler was their fight over the necessity of a putsch in Munich.
What?
A putsch? A putsch is... the best way to describe it is just like a violent coup attempt.
Okay.
We're sort of familiar with those in our recent history here. But
Yeah.
so Hitler thought it would be necessary to have this to start a nationalist revolution. But Eckhart thought it would only end in failure. Now, the specific event that we're going to refer to here is called the Beer Hall Putsch. And what this was an attempted coup d'etat to take over Munich and challenge the Weimar Republic. The Nazi Party believed that if they could take over this one city, they would be able to gain enough influence to challenge the overall government of Germany. So, on November 8th, 1923, 2,000 Nazi members marched on the Bergenbrockkeller, which was this large beer hall. It was just a big public social space. There'd be a lot of people there. They'd be able to really challenge their movement and make a scene, basically, by trying to have this putsch.
Yeah.
The crowd was riled up by Hitler's speech, and chaos ensued throughout the night. Violent chaos trying to overthrow the local government and the local police and military. This event occurred over basically 2 days and night. It was just nonstop fighting and chaos. But eventually the Nazis were held off by the Bavarian police and the German army. In total, 16 Nazis and 4 Bavarian police officers were killed, and dozens more were injured, and many were arrested. Hitler actually escaped from this event, but he was later arrested a few days outside of town, and he was charged with treason and imprisoned. He was charged with 5 years, but actually only served, I think, about a year, maybe less, inside prison. But it was...
So he served for treason before being the leader of the country.
Yep. And it was while he was in prison that he wrote his famous Mein Kampf, the book about
That's terrifying.
his struggle and... Right. Eckhart himself was not believed to have participated in the beer hall putsch, but he may have been a spectator of the event. He was believed at least to have been present for it, because he was also arrested for the same event, but was released due to having severe illness. He was released from prison. And while awaiting trial for this participation or non-participation, he passed away on December 26, 1923, from a heart attack, which is likely caused by years of alcoholism and his morphine addiction. Hitler actually dedicated his second volume of Mein Kampf to Dietrich Eckart. Hitler said that Eckart was, quote, one of the best, one who devoted his life to the awakening of our people in his writings and his thoughts, and finally in his deeds. Hitler's relationship with Eckart was one of the best things he experienced in the 1920s, and that he never again had a friend with whom he felt such a harmony of thinking and feeling.
It's a chilling endorsement when coming from Adolf Hitler.
One of the things I thought when I researched this, and like I said at the beginning, there's nothing really good or redeeming about Dietrich Eckart, but as I was reading this, and it wasn't really a pleasant study for me, but he wasn't violent or...
Right.
I want to say cruel, but I guess he was cruel in a way. He didn't torture or kill anyone. He didn't enslave anyone. Some of the things that we've criticized other people on our podcast for doing, Eckhart didn't do those things, but it was his anti-Semitic ideology and his influence and the way that he used his thinkings to influence other people, specifically one of the worst people in human history, that really makes him just an all-around awful guy that we don't have really anything good to say about him. During Hitler's rule, there were several streets, monuments, schools, Eckhart's hometown, and even a 1936 Olympic arena that were named in his honor. All of those things have now been renamed, torn down, or rededicated to someone else. Essentially, Eckhart's history was kind of wiped clean from these areas of Germany. It's kind of funny that we make another bad comparison, I guess, to today, but we make a big deal about renaming and tearing down Confederate statues and military bases and whatnot. But it's not erasing history. It's just not honoring these people. You know, Eckhart still existed. Hitler still existed. We know this. We can look this up and read about it, and we can talk about for over an hour about his history and his story. But we don't need to have monuments to these people that committed these atrocities.
Yeah, he doesn't have any statues, yet somehow we were able to do this episode.
I actually found a really interesting YouTube video, and I wish I knew the guy's name so I could give him credit, but it was just a guy who found Eckhart's grave and was standing in a cemetery in a small town in Germany and telling the story of Dietrich Eckart. And it was amazing to me how intact and well-maintained his grave was. Because of all these monuments that have been torn down, you would expect that this one thing that is really the, I don't know, grandest monument to his life is still there and well-maintained, because this is obviously an evil man that, you know, is worth knowing about so that we don't repeat these things. But also, like we said about Peer Gynt, just a sad poet who really didn't accomplish anything good for the world and has since been forgotten. It's also important to note to even again express how important he was to the Nazi movement, that Hitler himself regarded Eckhart as the, quote, spiritual co-founder of Nazism, and he said he was a guiding light of the early National Socialist movement.
So, another, I guess, hypothetical thought experiment for you. If Eckhart was able to embody all of the things in Hitler that he didn't have, basically, if you replaced Hitler with Eckhart, do you think it would have went the way it went? Do you think Eckhart had the atrocities in him that Hitler was capable of carrying out, planning, whatever you want to say? Huge hypothetical, lots of... I mean, I know you can't answer that definitely.
I mean,
but
no, I don't know, but I think anyone who gains power is capable of things that you wouldn't think they were capable of without that power. I think what prevented Eckhart from being the leader himself may have been his vices with alcoholism and morphine, that he may have been a very good writer and a well-spoken person in conversation like he had with Hitler, but I don't know that he would have necessarily given these grand speeches to rile up the crowds and to draw people to the Nazi movement. So his writings can be edited and can be fine-tuned in a way to clearly express his point, but maybe he wouldn't have been able to be as influential as Hitler was to get to that point of power. Once you're in that point of power, who knows what you're capable of? If you have enough hate in your heart, which he clearly seems to have had, I'm sure he could have done some real damage.
Yeah. The reason I asked is because I'm sitting here, I guess, in my own head trying to assign how much evil I want to apply to him. Trying to decide moral fault to a pretty fuzzy situation. But
I say that we just finish this episode and then never mention him again.
All right. We're going to have to talk about him on social media when we publish the episode.
Crap.
Yep.
Let's go to the quiz.
But for now, let's go to the quiz. Have a little bit of fun. We'll be right back.
We just want to take a minute and thank you for listening to History's B-Side. It takes a lot of time to research and put these episodes together, so we wanted to let you know how you can support the show going forward.
Go ahead and subscribe at anchor.fm/History's B-Side, or wherever you're listening from. If you'd like, leave us a review and tell us what you think of our show.
If you're interested in advertising with the show and hearing your message in a spot like this, send us an email to historiesbside@gmail.com.
We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening. All right, welcome back. So as some of you may know, we like to end every episode with a short quiz for our host, just to see how thoroughly he studied and how much he's learned, and also to give our listeners a chance to test their own knowledge and see what they know about our topic. Today's questions, I'm a bit worried they're too difficult, but I think that's okay. I mean,
honestly, I studied more for this episode than probably any of my previous episodes, but I don't know. The Holocaust is so dense, so if you have questions that are about specific things that happened throughout the Holocaust, I might know it, but I'm a little worried I'm going to struggle.
I mean, two of them are pretty broad. The ones regarding the Nazi party are broad. One is about Peer Gynt, so that one I'll be surprised if you get. But we'll start with one of the more straightforward Nazi questions. So the kind of quintessential classic Nazi symbol is the swastika, which is a cross with hooked ends. But as I'm sure you know, and most people know, the swastika wasn't first used by the Nazi party. It was a religious symbol for hundreds of years beforehand, which had many meanings, but the most commonly referenced meaning was what? It was a symbol for...
Oh, I know this, and as soon as you said it, I knew this was going to be the question, and I have to think now. It's either Hindu or Buddhist, isn't it?
It was used in both.
Oh.
It was used in many Eastern religions.
Is it like a symbol of peace?
Not. I mean, I was going to say close, but that's not technically close.
Oh.
It was a symbol of good fortune or good luck.
Oh. At least I got the religion sort of right.
Yeah. All right. For what is probably the most difficult of the three.
Great.
In reference to the play Peer Gynt. In 1875, composer Edvard Grieg composed a piece that was used for the sixth scene of Act 2 in Heinrich Ibsen's play, Peer Gynt. Now, that sounds really obscure, but this piece is a really well-known, really well-referenced orchestral piece that is used in dozens of different films, including Disney films. Most recently, the most recent time I've heard it was in The Social Network, which is one of your hints. It was used during the scene where the Winklevoss twins are rowing crew. But we also played it in our high school orchestra. I don't know if it was junior year or senior year. I know you... Oh, no, we played this. Yeah, we definitely played this. You would notice it to hear it.
So I
it
definitely
directly references one of the characters.
I definitely read that about the composer, because I think they only used like 2 of the suites that he wrote when they actually adapted the poem for stage.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm kicking myself for not having watched The Social Network yet, because I keep saying I'm going to. Not The Social Network, Social Dilemma. Whatever you just said it was in.
I was referencing The Social Network. They're both great, though.
Oh. I definitely haven't seen that movie. Shoot. I don't know, because I'm going to guess that this was the year I wasn't in orchestra then, because it's not familiar to me, but maybe if I heard it. Oh!
In the Hall of the Mountain King is the title.
Wow. I don't think I was in orchestra to play that, but I do know that song. Interesting.
Yeah. It was funny. It's one of those songs that every time I hear it, I'm like, oh my god, what is that? And I can never remember the title. And then it came up in my trivia search. Weird connection.
Can you sing more of it so that our listeners make sure that they know the song? We'll have to see if that's public domain so we can play it in the episode.
That would be a good idea. I feel like it probably is. It was composed 200 years ago.
Yeah,
over 200
probably.
years ago. No, that's not true. 120 years ago. 30 years ago. I don't know. Math is hard right now. All right. For your third and final question, one of the premier kind of paramilitary forces in the Nazi Germany force was titled the SS. What did SS stand for, and what did that name mean?
Shoot. This is one of those that I definitely know from my history of reading reading about the Holocaust, but I don't know. I'm not going to come up with it on the spot.
No way in hell I would have gotten it. So SS stands for Schutzstaffel, which is German for protective echelon. And they initially served as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguards before later becoming...
Weren't they like secret police, or am I thinking of...
Well, they eventually became that, yeah.
Okay.
They started as his personal bodyguards, but obviously became much more than that later on.
Oh, man.
Those are pretty brutal questions.
You think we're done with Holocaust episodes, or you think there'll be more?
I mean, I have one coming up in the next several weeks. I mean, it's not a Holocaust episode. It's a World War II episode about the French resistance.
I have someone on my list who fought in World War II, although it's not really important to the rest of the, Holocaust Nazi story. So we definitely have people from the time period.
I keep saying I'm going to find a scientist that'll be bright and cheery. So maybe I'll look one of those up for the next few weeks.
Hopefully your next topic is a little bit happier.
I think it will be, in a way.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening. Obviously, this wasn't our most fun episode, but an important one to listen to and to know the history on. So thank you for listening if you made it this far, and please make sure you pay attention to what's happening in your country and history doesn't repeat itself.
Please. We'll see you guys next week.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service, and follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can support the show by visiting anchor.fm/historiesbside.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.